Now that we had a basic introduction to financial independence in part 1, we're going to tackle frugality and how to reduce your expenses. So let's get started with this Homeroom episode all about frugality. So the passive income side of things can actually get pretty complicated, and that's going to be covered in the next video. For this video though, we're going to look at something that we all have a lot more control over, and that's expenses. What can you do to reduce expenses? A lot of the common wisdom out there is actually not that great. A lot of it is kind of like penny pinching and, random tips to save a few bucks here and save a few bucks there. So on the expenses side of things, let's first talk about housing. For most people, that's actually your most expensive thing every month. First up to think about, how much house do you really need? Think about how large your house is versus what parts of it you actually use. Do you have a lot of unused space? Now, not everyone's going to have that problem, of course, but if you have a lot more space than you need, you can always think about downsizing, and that's going to drastically cut your monthly housing cost. Also, think about your housing location and your commute. How far away you live from your work has a great impact on your commuting expenses. If you're thinking, hey, I can get a much cheaper house and it's way further away, you may not actually be saving the amount of money that you think in the long run. Another big question is buying versus renting. I know not everyone has the option to buy, but if you do have that choice, look at the different calculators out there and see what makes sense for your situation. Sometimes you can save a lot of money. For instance, there's a large cost to buying and selling a home. So if you're not going to be in one place for a long time, it doesn't really make sense to buy. Usually they say you should be planning to spend at least 3 to 5 years in a house before selling it to be able to recoup all the different costs. Of course, another factor in the buy versus rent equation is your home as an investment. This hasn't always been the case, but certainly in the last 10 years or so, home values have increased much quicker than a lot of other assets, including even the stock market. Will that continue? Nobody really knows, but it's certainly one factor to consider is that if you do buy a house, it may continue to appreciate. Another factor is to look at mortgage rates and your amortization period. Even if you have a fairly low mortgage rate, if you're amortizing over 25 or even 30 years, the total amount of interest that you're paying is substantial. Another big cost when it comes to housing is renovations. Now, most people like living in a nicely renovated house, but renovation projects are typically very expensive, and unfortunately the research shows that you very rarely get the money out of a renovation that you put into it. So if you do a $25,000 kitchen renovation, it's very unlikely that that renovation is going to bring up the value of your home by that same amount. But of course, you want to live somewhere nice, and if you enjoy it, that can still be a very valid expense. Next up, let's talk about transportation. So the first question you should ask yourself is, do I need a car? If the answer is yes, do we need a second car? Vehicles are extremely expensive. Mel and I have had some experience with this. We've actually lived decent portions of our lives without vehicles. For instance, when we lived downtown Toronto for a year, we didn't have a car at all. When we were traveling Europe for a year, we didn't own a vehicle. Now, mind you, when we lived in New Zealand, we did actually buy a car. It was a 20-year-old Mercedes 190E, and it was the best car ever. So, cars can certainly bring a lot of joy, and they have a lot of convenience, but they're also extremely expensive. So, if you can do without a vehicle, you can save a ton of money that way. The other thing you should look at is buying a car versus leasing a car. So not everyone realizes that leasing a car is really just renting it. Hopefully that hasn't just shocked you right now, but when you lease a car, you're not building up any value. You're basically just paying for the use of that vehicle during the time of that lease. It's almost always more expensive to lease a car rather than buy it. So you have to think beyond just the monthly payment. Obviously the monthly payment of a lease is going to be a lot less, but the total cost in the end is going to be a lot more. So another thing with cars is you have to think about brand new versus used. So a brand new car, you've probably heard the expression that it loses X amount of dollars, the minute you drive off the lot. Well, that's actually very true. The amount of depreciation on a brand new car is staggering. So even if you just buy a car that's 1 or 2 years old, you can save a ton of money. You can probably save about 1/4 of the cost of the car by buying one that's not brand new. And then if you get into something that's 3 to 5 years old, you can probably pay about half of what you would the brand new cost. And really, a lot of times it's almost in the exact same condition. You're not going to get major maintenance costs until probably older than 5 years, maybe even older than 7 years with a lot of modern cars. Unless, of course, you get a lemon, which, I've been there and done that. But there's nothing saying that a brand new car won't be a lemon either. I'll tell you, I bought a brand new car once, exactly once, and that car was an absolute lemon. It had electronics problems coming out the wazoo. So my advice certainly is to buy something used and to look for something usually in the 3 to 5 year old range. That's going to save you the most money overall if you do in fact need a vehicle. So that's a good overview of the 2 largest expenses that most people have. Next up, we're going to take a look at some other expenses that are easy to cut back on. So this episode, we're going to look at, we actually have spent Oh, and one final quick thing. Be sure to sign up for our mailing list on homearome.com and we'll send you a PDF summarizing all of this information.